Cordelia. I love her most.
Welcome back to another episode of Thrown It All Away. I am Joey.
And I'm Isabelle.
And today we're going to be discussing the themes of King Lear and how they translate into some modern media examples. Isn't that right, Isabelle?
That's right, Joey. We're going to be going over a couple of the main themes that we see in Shakespeare's play. So we're going to go through some of the complex family dynamics that we see, as well as this betrayal. We're also going to be talking about this loss of power and or status, as well as this descension into madness. And we're going to be connecting those to a few modern media examples. And what are those examples, Joey?
They will be the TV shows Succession, as well as The Crown. And I think I'll be taking the lead on The Crown, and you'll be taking over with Succession.
That's right. And I think while both of these media examples do have all of these themes, in terms of Succession, we absolutely see these complex familial dynamics, and we also see this descension into madness as well. What do we see in The Crown?
Well, I think what we see in The Crown, it's very interesting that it's based on real life. Of course, it is dramatized, but this actually happened, a lot of the stories, most of the stories. So it'll be interesting to delve into the ramifications of talking about a real-life story. And then I think at the end we're going to be talking about if it's more tragic that it is a true story as opposed to something like King Lear.
Absolutely. And while Succession is not real, I think a lot of these dynamics we see amongst the father and his children is something that many people can relate to, and I think I absolutely see the ties between these dynamics and the dynamics that we see in King Lear.
So, Isabelle, I think before we dive in, we should give our listeners a quick synopsis of sort of the main driving plot point of King Lear. What sort of sets off the downfall?
Absolutely. Well, there are many major plot points in King Lear. I think one of the key events and a sort of turning point that we see in terms of their relationship between King Lear and his daughters is whenever we see him divide his land, not based on loyalty or based on a true relationship, but rather on who can appease him the most. And so we see Goneril and Regan really play into this game, whereas Cordelia says she loves him according to my bond, no more, no less. Meaning she does love him, however, she's not going to appease him, and she's not going to act any differently as she normally would.
Yeah, it's not going to be performative.
Absolutely. She's
not going to put on a show just for her father to get land like her sisters are doing.
Exactly. And we see her punished for this. We see that Goneril and Regan are given the land because they performed, and Cordelia, who before this would be maybe considered his favorite, is actually banished.
But of course, later on in the play, we do see this backfire for King Lear.
Absolutely.
As both of his other daughters, the ones who appeased him and decided to put on the performance, betrayed him. Whereas Cordelia comes around in the end and he ends up living with her.
Absolutely. Despite the fact that he had done so many things to her and she had so many reasons to hold it against him, we actually do see, as you say, her coming in the last moment to save him after Goneril and Regan had kicked him out.
And the dynamic of one character not playing into a sort of role that is expected of them. Right. And that's Cordelia and King Lear. And for my example of The Crown, I would say both Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth's sister, as well as Princess Diana play that role of Cordelia.
Do you want to give us a quick premise of The Crown, just so people kind of have an idea of the characters and things, although it is a real-life event, so people are probably a bit familiar?
Yes, of course. So basically, The Crown starts with Queen Elizabeth's father becoming king after his brother, King Edward, abdicates the throne so he can marry an American actress who is also divorced.
Interesting.
So Princess Margaret and then Princess Elizabeth, who later became queen, went through their childhood never expecting Elizabeth to ascend to the throne.
Right.
Because it was her uncle who was king, and it would be his descendants. But after the abdication, it threw everything into chaos.
Right. And
all of a sudden, Margaret was faced with a very strange dilemma where her equal, her sister, their beloved sister, was now at a higher status.
Right.
And she didn't quite know how to deal with that or play into the role
So competition is kind of starting to form there.
Oh, yes, 100%.
And I think we see that again between Goneril and Regan, for sure, in terms of competing. And amongst the three of them, really competing for the father's approval.
Yes. And in a broader sense, I say Margaret was more well-liked by maybe not just her family, but people in general. Right. She was more outgoing, whereas Elizabeth was always more playing by the rules, and possibly because she knew that one day she would have to ascend that throne.
Right, so she had an image to maintain.
Yes. She plays into the story of royalty, whereas Margaret sees that as something that's taking away from her. Okay. Taking her sister away, also taking away her ability to live her own life. She has to live in the shadow. And I'm reminded of one scene in particular, after Elizabeth and Margaret's father, the king, dies, and Elizabeth ascends the throne. She's now queen. When they're walking out of the bedroom where their father died, Elizabeth goes ahead, and Margaret tries to follow her immediately because they always walked in tandem.
Right.
But their mother said, wait. You have to wait behind your sister now. She's the queen.
Oh, so there's this change in power dynamics.
Yes. So that immediately isolated Margaret.
Right.
And she only found, power in having lavish parties. And then she became the sort of oddball who was going too hard into the parties. That was the only way she found power that she used to have.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I think that gives us a good premise and a good base of understanding so that now we can kind of jump into these themes that we see in King Lear, but then also in what you're talking about, The Crown, as well. So what are some of those themes that you see that tie those two?
I think I see a couple, definitely. But right off the bat, I'm reminded of sort of family dynamics taking a back seat to role and performance and status.
Absolutely something that is pivotal in King Lear.
Oh, for sure. And we see when Cordelia tries to take that more loving approach,
right,
or as much as she's
as much required, as she's required to.
Yes, whatever that means in terms of love, but yes. We see it backfires for her greatly. And I see a very big parallel with Princess Diana in that story as well. She comes from a very wealthy background,
right?
But still, there was more natural family love. And when she is thrown into this institution, they always refer to it as an institution and not a family. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. And I don't know if that was a dramatic choice on the part of Peter Morgan and the rest of the team of writers. But nonetheless, we see Diana ostracized and sort of pushed away as something other, something that doesn't fit. She's not playing the correct role.
Similar to Cordelia, one would say.
For sure.
And I think also with Cordelia, whenever she doesn't play this role, she similarly is ostracized. Okay, so what themes do you see connecting King Lear and the Crown? I think obviously we see these complex familial dynamics. I think specifically in terms of the Crown, we see this intense patriarchal figure absolutely in King Lear. We see this in the way he interacts with those close to him as well as beneath him. So how do you see this connection between those?
That is definitely the next theme we're going to dive into, the intense patriarchal figures in both of these works. In King Lear, obviously, we have King Lear. But in The Crown, I feel like there is a few. And one of them is sort of in a patriarchal role, but she is a woman. She is the queen. And she's trying to maintain sort of this institution that doesn't really have power.
Right.
It's sort of all performance. And they mention that a lot in the show.
Yeah.
They say, this is all for show. Monarchy is the majesty and the mystery.
Right.
But not really anything else anymore.
And we absolutely see this fall from graces in King Lear whenever he is then kicked out. He's on the streets. He no longer has this power. He thought he was seemingly untouchable and has now been kicked out by his daughters and is roaming the streets powerless.
But the fool is always there.
It's true.
It's very important, even in a position of power or false power where you're just pretending that you have it still, that somebody is in your ear and can actually talk to you.
Right.
I feel like actually in The Crown, Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, would fulfill that role.
Yeah.
He, similarly to Diana, came in and did not want to play the role, did not want to be subservient to his wife, because he had to be subservient to the Queen, not his wife. And he found that distinction really difficult playing that part.
And is he also one that's often overlooked? Because I think in King Lear, we see the jester is never really the focus. He's always in the background. However, whenever we do see King Lear has lost everything, the jester becomes the most important figure in his life. He's now the only person he can rely on. So do you see also that similarity in The Crown?
Oh, 100%. Just naturally, I'm thinking about the scene with Margaret having to wait behind her own sister. Throughout his whole life, Prince Philip had to fulfill that role too. He, just in title, he couldn't be king. Even though he was technically the Queen's consort, he could not have the title of king because technically that would make him above his wife, and she's the reigning monarch. So he had to just be okay with the title of prince, which he didn't like in the beginning very much. But still, during his whole life, he realized that he needed to be in the background and support. And there was always some resentment under there, even though there was real love. And he ended up talking to Diana in some points, like, because he went through the same things.
Okay.
He was ostracized by the Queen's family for a while for not playing that role. But him acting as sort of the fool character of The Crown and the real life situation lended itself where he had some real influence over the Queen. He modernized the institution very much so, even if in the realm of love it was sort of lacking. His son, Charles, kind of inherited his infidelity, which of course wasn't good, which ties into, I think, our next theme of betrayal.
Yeah, absolutely. A main theme throughout. And I think one of the plot points that really catapults King Lear into this realization of what a loss of power he has had, how much of it was simply an image, how much of it was something that you can easily lose. And so I think that betrayal is a key turning point, and it's something that we're also going to later talk about in Succession, another main theme throughout the show. For sure.
Obviously, betrayal with Charles and Diana, with Charles actually loving Camilla the entire time. And we see what happened in Diana's story. She was really thrown into chaos, no fault of her own. And she tried to make the best of it for a while and then had to be out of the sort of institution of the royal family, which then led to her untimely death as well, as she was trying to recapture her life, trying to find power in things that weren't related to the crown. And so do you think that theme of betrayal relates to Succession at all?
Absolutely. I think, just to give a quick premise of the show, it's about a very, very wealthy family who the CEO is actually their father. His name is Logan Roy, and he would be described as a pretty cold and, I would consider, a pretty awful person, not only to those around him, but to his family as well. He does not have the typical familial relationship, similar to, I would say, King Lear and his daughters.
Definitely. I'm seeing an immediate connection to
Absolutely.
King Lear and his daughters. But would you say that they map perfectly? Would you say there's a Cordelia in this story?
I would say there actually isn't a Cordelia in this story. I think Cordelia is a character who has many redeeming qualities, and at her heart, I would say, is a good person. Unfortunately, I would say in Succession, I wouldn't say that any of his kids do have those redeeming qualities. I would say they more so fall under this Goneril and Regan archetype, wherein they will do anything for power and status. So, similarly, I think the immediate connection I saw was this desperation for his approval, for their father's approval, because they know where they can get them to. They know that if they appease their father, they will then be kind of grandfathered into the company. They will be set for life, monetarily speaking. And so therefore, they do whatever their father asks of him, and he treats them terribly, and they accept it. And I think you absolutely see that in King Lear as well.
Definitely. Would you say that in Succession, there's any point where a character loses their power?
I would. I think we do throughout the show see Roy not struggle to maintain his power, but it does become shaky at points. He goes through a major health scare in the beginning, and so then we see one of his sons actually try and overthrow him, try to become CEO, kind of grab it from under him. So we constantly see that there is no real loyalty amongst the family. But I think rather a character that you begin to kind of feel for is Kendall, who is his oldest son and is one who desperately wants his father's approval, and we see continually is falling short. But I think in terms of betrayal, we absolutely see later in the seasons he ends up throwing his dad under the bus. He, I think, is kind of at its wit's end and realizes he's never going to get that approval, which I think is kind of what we see in Cordelia there, of she's saying, I do love you, but I'm not going to do whatever it takes to show it to you. I'm going to stay true to myself, and that's something that we don't see in Succession, actually.
That's very interesting, actually. To bring it back to the crown, actually, I thought of something while you were talking. When King Edward abdicated the throne, he was sort of doing it for his own personal gain, not really for the pursuit of power, which is an interesting shift from what we're used to seeing with King Lear.
Right.
And the daughters especially. They're really doing it just for power. But also, once King Edward stopped being King Edward, and then they bestowed upon him Duke of Windsor, just so he could still have a title. I think that's interesting. They still gave him a title because he's used to that power. And throughout the rest of his life, he sort of was clamoring for some semblance of power, some semblance of having people to care for him. Like, he was exiled and he had to live in France, and he named his house Villa Windsor. And he had a servant who he made dress in a very royal outfit, the same that he would have when he was king.
Interesting.
And he would host these lavish parties and dress garishly. So he was searching for that, something that he gave up himself. So here, in that one character, we have a very interesting dynamic. We have the daughters, we have Cordelia, who voluntarily gave up power, but we also have the other daughters in one who's still vying for something. We have King Lear, who's still longing for power, even after he doesn't, with his 100 knights. Whatever he says in the forest, he was like, I'll send my 100 knights for you, even though he doesn't have the power. But going back to Succession, and how there isn't really a Goneril parallel.
Yeah.
Would you say that there are any other parallel characters between King Lear and Succession?
Absolutely. I think, too, that we see that play a really pivotal role in King Lear and also in Succession are the roles of Kent and the Jester. I think Kent serves as kind of King Lear's confidant. He's one of his most loyal and trusted, I would say, people. But then we see that he is kind of betrayed when he is then thrown out, when he has to serve. Right. When he has to serve King Lear in disguise. But throughout this, he's kind of known for his moral compass. And I think that is something we absolutely see in the character of Tom in Succession. He, I think, is the outsider. He's the black sheep. He's not actually a part of the family. He is married to one of the daughters. And so he's kind of seen as an afterthought. And he's known as expendable and kind of someone who is often forgotten. And I think that kind of also ties into one of his, I would say, best friends in the show and kind of his compadres is Greg, who serves as the Jester. Throughout the show, Greg is seen as the comedic relief. He's the one you send on the jobs that no one else wants to do, kind of the throwaway character, but ends up being in these really pivotal moments. He's the kind of mastermind between the downfall of Roy. He is kind of there in those important moments, although he's often seen as a background character.
That's very interesting. And the last parallel I've been thinking about between my example of The Crown and King Lear is Edmund and Edgar, and how Edgar is the legitimate son, and Edmund's in the background always illegitimate. And thinking of Margaret and Elizabeth again. And of course, both of them are legitimate. But in the sort of social situations, Edgar is Elizabeth and Edmund is Margaret. And she's always trying to get power. She's trying to get one over on Elizabeth, even though she loves her very deeply. So it's not an exact parallel, but...
Yeah, you absolutely see some of the same dynamics.
And similarly... not related at all, but Diana and Camilla. Diana is there, loved by the public, and then pushed away.
The other woman.
Pushed away by the other woman. Oh, I love Diana so much. Now, Isabelle, now that we talked about some themes that King Lear shares with these more contemporary examples,
Right.
why do we think that these themes have lasted this long? Audiences have been wanting to see works that touch on these themes. Of King Lear's from the early 1600s, and yet in 2025, we're still seeing new media examples
Right.
where people follow these stories.
It's a good question, and I think one of the reasons is despite the fact that this was written in the early 1600s, the themes are as relevant today as they were then. I think complex family dynamics are something we all experience. While they're maybe not as dramatized as in kind of the media that we watch, it's absolutely something we all experience. Would you agree?
100%. I'd also say there's a sort of Schadenfreude, to borrow a nice German word, where sort of like...
And for those of us who don't know what that means.
It's sort of deriving pleasure from seeing someone else fall.
Okay.
Um,
Just something we absolutely see in King Lear and in all of these.
oh, for sure. That's why audiences go to see it. That's why it's still prevalent today. We like to see people that have what we don't have
Yeah.
fall to a place that is similar to us and see how they react to it. See how these privileged people react to being lowly like us.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I hope that our listeners are able to gain a better understanding of these themes that we see in Shakespeare's
Me too.
King Lear.
Live from Alumni, we would like to sign off on this wonderful, breezy, warm night.
It's true.
And thank you for listening, and we hope you got a deeper insight on King Lear and its impact on media today.
Cordelia. I love her most.